I write, as you probably heard, I wrote for 1889 in the secondary market. I wrote for Challenge. I did some articles for Challenge as a freelancer. I did a lot of articles for Transactions, Royal Martian Geographical Society as a freelancer. Not that the second group paid me, because they didn't. But I wrote a lot of different stuff. And when 1889 went under, I was very sad because I really did like it very much. Okay. Because it was an interesting setting. Yeah, there were things I didn't like about it, but there was a lot I did like about it. One of the things I liked about it was it wasn't we glue gears on things just to glue gear onto things like most steampunk is. So it was much more what I tend to call either Victorian science fiction or steam pulp, because it lacks the other thing about punk is when you talk about cyberpunk, it has a dystopian flavor to it usually, or a connotation of a dystopian universe. And I'm not a dystopian universe kind of person. I don't like dystopian future fiction very much, so I tend to be a little more hopeful than that. And I have a very active Yahoo group that sometimes says I'm way too hopeful. So that's their problem, not mine, so I'm just going to let it slide. So after a while, I was pretty active on some of the Yahoo groups for 1889, and my ideas began to split off more and more from what was going on in those communities. So we formed our own community, Hive Queen and Country. And I wrote a role-playing game for it, which is now being reissued in its second edition because the company that put it out went under. So I've had to form my own company, which was not what I wanted to do, but that's how it all works out. So, as if you've been in the A Hall, there's we're putting on a very large miniatures game down there, right in front of the Chick-fil-A.
Oh.
So, which is taking place in Panama, but it's giant bugs and Teddy Roosevelt. So you can't really beat those two things together. In this universe, the humans from Earth managed to get off the planet in the late 1800s. They go to Mars, they go to Venus. They find that Mars is in the final processes of being terraformed by aliens. And these same aliens had used Venus as a staging area previous to finishing up on Mars. So they had harvested human beings to work on both those planets for them. We looked at Venus and we didn't want to do what everybody else does, which is Venus is this hothouse greenhouse planet. Obviously, we can't use Venus as it is because it's completely uninhabitable by any life as we know it. But in so much fiction, Venus is just this huge jungle planet, and 1889 was like that. What we did was we looked at the albedo of Venus and how much cloud cover it has. And we did some math and we figured out that if Venus has almost no greenhouse gases, then the surface temperature of Venus could actually be a few degrees lower on average than the surface temperature on Earth because it loses so much energy to the reflecting clouds. So we went with actually a very cold, not a very cold, but a cold desert. It's cool. The water cycle on Venus is unique in any planetary system I've ever seen in fiction. It only rains in the mountains. So all the water from the oceans, and it's an ocean planet, it's about 80% water, all the water that evaporates from that goes up into the clouds, and the only places it rains are in the mountains above 5,000 feet that actually penetrate into the clouds.
It just floods constantly.
Yes, it rains constantly there, but all the rivers that come down are like the Amazon. They're huge. So you end up with cloud forests where it constantly rains, these really deep river valleys that are very much cut, and you have a miniature water cycle in there, and then you have these big basalt plains where nothing really lives, and then you have the oceans. So the ecozones are really tightly drawn, and that drives a lot of human culture on the planet. So, yeah.
I can't recall. What did you decide for the day length in there?
We went for 24 hours just because, and it does not have a retrograde orbit.
Convenient and easy.
Yeah, it's just, we just cheated because you can't use a 238-day long day.
But you could have potentially done something else
Yeah.
that made it unique or interesting, and I just couldn't remember.
No, we actually decided it'd be a lot easier on everybody if we didn't do that. And the other thing is Mars' rotational period is almost 1 day long too, so it works out pretty evenly and you don't have to do a lot of messing with it. And we also put Venus on, basically, Venus has the closest to a circular orbit of any of the planets in the solar system, and we gave it, instead of having its whacked axial tilt that it has now, we gave it no axial tilt. So there's almost no seasons on Venus. There's almost, you can't do any stellar astronomy there. Obviously, you can never see the stars. And you can't really do any solar astronomy or solar navigation there because the sun is just this big blob through the clouds and it almost never changes. So that becomes sort of important to a number of different cultural aspects. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is the native forces on the planet of Venus. Another thing that we really didn't want to do when we did world design here was have the natives on Venus be somebody that the European colonialists could walk over. All right, the Zulus put up a good fight, the Afghans put up a good fight, but none of them were able to fend off the industrial might of the Western powers and Japan when it finally came down to it. So we didn't want that to happen. We want it to be much more equitable. The Venusians have a lot of technology that Earthers don't have. Earth has technology Venus doesn't have. One of the obvious things was the Venusians have never developed optics, because why would you? You don't need, telescopes are of no use. Speaking of no use,
Cable.
no, it's not working at all.
I can see it.
You're just hallucinating.
I don't think so. I got more.
Ooh, is that?
Another $5.
Oh, thank you.
Turns out we were shorted a bit on our voucher thing.
Thank you. So I like your Rolls-Royce armored car on your shirt.
Yes. And that's a real thing, unit, you know. I'm sure you know that, right?
It's a what?
Real unit.
I can't even read it. What is it?
The Royal Naval Armored Car Division.
Yeah, that's a real unit.
Part of the Royal Naval Air Service.
Yes. You were in that unit, weren't you?
Yeah, that would be tough, wouldn't it? I'd be how old? 100, how much?
Exactly. I'm surprised they let you in because you were pretty old when it was formed, right?
Yes, I got that portrait up my attic you just don't know about.
God, that thing must be so ugly.
Not as ugly as some of those faces down on the head down there.
All right. So we had made some decisions that we wanted the Venusian powers to be powerful enough that, given the logistical burden of getting from Earth to Venus, there was no way that the Earthers were going to be able to have everything their own way. So that drove a lot of what we did. We also wanted to look at the interactions between the Venusian cultures before and then after the Earthers arrived. Because one thing Europeans were really, really good at is, we showed up and you two groups are already at war. So we're either going to arm both of you and let you kill each other, or we're going to pick one side, arm them, and have them kill the other guys. I mean, it worked for the Spanish against the Aztecs. So it worked in New Zealand. It's pretty effective. Well, on Venus, the Venusians have actually turned that to their own benefit. And we can talk about that. But let's talk about the native Venusian forces. So here's our map of Venus. And you can see it is mostly a water world. It's got ice caps on both ends. This is using the NASA's radar data map. And what we did was I arbitrarily picked an elevation level where the sea line was and said, yep, that's where it is. So you can see it's got basically two major continents, a northern continent and then this equatorial continent, and then it's got a bunch of archipelagos. Because if nothing else, the word archipelago is fun to say.
Terry,
Yes?
is that only to a certain latitude and the ones above that are the things that are feeding in the water, or
Let's go back.
what's above or below the lines there of that particular map?
That's ice caps.
Ice caps, okay.
Yep, that's ice caps. So, and you can see there's a mountain range right here, and that's feeding this. And then there's a bunch of rivers, and most of the rivers don't show up on here because they're too small. This one is the most important one, that's the Marby, which is the main cultural center that we're going to talk about, because this is where the humans landed, okay? Or the Earthers landed, because everybody here is human. Okay. So, this is Equatoria, and you can see that's where the river is. Up. So, in the Equatorian area, this is where the Earthers landed. This area is what we call the Cloud Kingdoms. It's a bunch of independent city-states under a high king, and they are, in fact, within those cloud forests. There's another set of cloud forests right along here, feeding both this river and all these little rivers. This is the main river valley. If that river looks artificial because it's a perfect sine wave, it actually is artificial. The aliens built it as an irrigation system. Up here we have the Sea Kings, and we'll talk about them. This is where the Naxli live, we'll talk about them. This is the monks, this is the Marby, and this is the Cloud Kingdom. So we'll talk about all those cultures. So the Naxli and the Marby and their allies, the Cloud Kingdom, and to a certain extent the monks down here, have been at war with the Sea Kings pretty much since time immemorial. The Sea Kings have a religion that is fanatical. They are waiting for the final conflict, which will be between the demons of the sky and the demons of the sea, and the good people of the soil and the earth. Yes?
What length of written or known history is there amongst these peoples, and how long do they know they've been doing what they've been doing?
About 2,000 years, give or take. Now, about 3,000 years ago, this had been being used by the aliens as basically farmland to farm stuff that was going to be used to terraform Mars. When they got done with it all, they just walked away from here and left it. They demolished a lot of stuff, but basically they just abandoned everyone there, figuring they'd all die. Of course, people being people, they didn't, because people are much hardier than anyone, any alien race would ever suspect. So they proceeded to then breed back into these cultures.
They've been evolving technology, or they've had basically the same technology as whole?
They've been evolving technology. So, and they were using, a lot of the technology they use is biotech, not genetic engineering so much as they have a lot of different products that were from bioengineered plants and animals. A good example of this is they have very fine wool from transplanted llamas that were brought from Earth to this planet. And not only is the wool very fine, but it's colored. So they don't do dyes, they just have blue llamas and red llamas, but then they don't have to worry about anything. It's color fast. So that's one of their major exports, is this wool that's color fast.
Exported back to Earth.
Earth, right. And they have the same with silk. It's not silkworms, it's not spiders, it's another type of arthropod, but it produces copious quantities of silk, and it's already pre-colored. And they use the silk for a lot of their armor needs as well. So that's Equatoria. So when the Earthers showed up, obviously, since they came from the sky, they were unclean, and the Sea Kings hated them instantly. And there were a couple of fairly major wars between Earth's foothold on this planet and the Sea Kings, especially their clients. And the Earthers actually managed to win. Now, the Venusian cultures around them were really impressed with this, because beating the Sea Kings is really hard, especially if you're not in a giant fortress, which is that city right there. Okay? I kind of think of this as Constantinople. It's just in the wrong place at the wrong time, but it seems to hang on through most sieges. Yeah?
How long have the Earthers been here?
If we're talking 1900, they've been here about 20 years. Okay, so they get there in the early 1880s. So what these allied Venusian states said was, we can't hold this area, and we know the Sea Kings are going to move into it. And when they do, they're going to cause us no end of grief. So what we'll do is we'll do this land grant, and we'll grant all of this area that's in marks, with the exception of our city areas, to the Earthers, and say, hey, you guys can have all this land, and you can colonize it, and you can bring down settlers, and you can farm. It's great farmland, you'll love it, it's fully irrigated, blah, blah, blah. All you got to do is keep the Sea Kings out of it. So instead of the Western powers doing this kind of thing to the indigenous people, the indigenous people kind of did it to the great powers of Earth. Okay? So we kind of wanted it to have a really different flavor than a lot of what's out there. So Equatoria, again, is one of the centers of known military power on Venus. There's lots of other places out there that the Earthers haven't really gotten to or don't know a whole lot about, but they've been interacting with these folks for about 15 years pretty regularly. Okay, so Equatoria has the Sea Kings and their client states, the Marbi, the Cloud Kingdoms, the Naxley, and the Monks. So, in addition, there's the southern region, and that's where that big circular thing is. And again, I haven't fleshed that out quite as much, but in that area is the Empire of Men and a very large pirate organization or cartel or whatever. There's also an unknown group called the Sky Pirates that have been giving the Sea Kings and now the Naxley a hard time. They use some kind of aircraft. Nobody's exactly sure how. No one's ever captured one of them. They attack very quickly out of the clouds. Apparently they can go through the clouds without any trouble, which really everybody finds very surprising, because there are things that live in the clouds, plus if you're in a cloud, it's really hard to see where the hell you're going. Yeah.
Is there a normal, or you said there were no seasons, cloud base, which tends to always be about
5,000 feet.
That's fairly regular.
Almost constant.
Okay.
The one thing that's constant on Venus is the weather. It never, ever changes.
And there's still enough sunlight to grow?
About 80%.
Okay.
About 80% Earth normal. So it's not great, but the thing about it is, since you don't have seasons, that's constantly 80%.
Well, since the indigenous people had biology powers, they could have adapted or been adapted for them plants which grow fine at that
And that was done by the
Do
aliens.
Earth plants adapt well? Do the Earthers go there use the native plants or their own plants, or both?
Both. Depends on the plant. I mean, obviously, if you have a tropical plant that needs high sunlight, it's not going to do very well. But there's plenty of plants that live in partial shade or full shade, and those do great. So there's a lot of that going on. Okay. And then, so there's these unknown sky pirates who have some sort of aerial technology that no one's very sure about, and some sort of really robust weapons technology. And then you have all these tribal entities, because every single island is cut off from everything else because the oceans are pretty dangerous. Plus, every one of these river valleys is separated from all the rest by either a cloud forest or a ridge of basalt rock. So you see a lot of what's called island evolution, where that culture plus the animals and plants in that area end up getting genetically and culturally isolated from everything else. So you have a lot of tribal cultures that don't really interact with other people, and there's no telling if you go into a valley or set foot on an island what is going to be there. Because island evolution in the biological sense can lead to like really small things or really big things, because there's a thing called island gigantism, and that's what led to the elephant birds on Madagascar and the similar looking but totally different genetic moas on New Zealand.
Although most of those processes on Earth take a considerably long time. Now, whether the aliens were able to accentuate that or do various things with
and
that.
they actually take a lot less time than you would think. Because think about 10,000 years ago, what was living on Earth, we had all the megafauna and everything, but think about what's evolved in the last 10,000 years to fill those niches that the megafauna abandoned when they ceased to exist. So evolution can go pretty darn fast if you've got a situation where you've got a lot of niches that are open. Okay. So the Sea Kings are a conquest state. They have an apocalyptic religion. They're very fanatical about it. They're a military religious oligarchy. Their primary enemy currently is the Naxali, who are sort of like Venice. Again, Venice, Constantinople. They have a city. They have some area around it. They're mostly traders. Okay? But their hereditary enemy is the Marbi. They hate the Marbi, and the Marbi hate them. Sea Kings are primarily heavy infantry. They have a very effective siege and civil engineering. Each city contributes to the state army. In terms of siege and civil engineering and heavy infantry, they're a lot like the Romans. But unlike the Romans, you see the army is made up more cosmopolitan, more across the board. It's not from any particular area. They expect every city to contribute to that. And since it's a religious duty, they're happy to do it. Yep.
Now, when I'm saying this, they're called the Sea Kings because they came in from the sea when they're attacking people, but they have their own land areas, which is where their power is actually based.
Right. And it's not so much that they come from the sea. The Sea Kings is actually sort of a joke because they hate the sea. They hate the ocean because the ocean is unclean.
So that's not the way they travel.
They do travel that way, but they hate it. Okay? But it's really the only way to get around because otherwise you're trying to go over these mountains or across these deserts. And the reason, we'll get into it in a minute, the reason the Marbi and the Sea Kings can't go head to head is there's a mountain range and a river between them and a desert. So logistically, they cannot cross that. They send patrols and it's, they count coup and stuff like that, but they can't get an army.
The Himalayas.
Right. So the Sea Kings have attacked the Naxali city several times. One time they did penetrate into the upper city. The Naxali city, if you want to visualize it, is a lot like Waterfall City from Dinotopia or whatever the Waterfall City from the Star Wars prequels was called. It's got a lower city which is down on the seacoast, and then up above it's got an upper city, and there's a big river that flows through it, and there's a big waterfall. The Naxali are very good at harnessing hydraulic energy, so that's where they get most of their power. The Sea Kings have attacked it several times. They did penetrate to the upper city once, but were driven out by the arrival of Marbi allies. So it was a close run thing. The Marbi and the Naxali get along pretty well. They've done each other's political favors.
Are there records or anecdotes that have come out about some other states which were totally conquered by the Sea Kings?
Oh, yeah.
So people know what happened to them when it happened?
Yes. Okay. Because actually, about 1,500 years ago, give or take, there were a number of coastal cities, and the Sea Kings totally wiped them out. And that's where the Marbi came from. And that's why the Marbi have basically a racial hate on for the Sea Kings. Because the Marbis were very happy, the proto-Marbis, or whatever you want to call them, were very happy living in these seaside cities. The Sea Kings managed to shut off their irrigation system. Those of them that didn't starve went on basically a long march, a pilgrimage, and ended up in the Marbi Valley. And Marbi means haven in their language. So that's how that conflict started and why it continues. Okay. These are the only known Sea King defeats. The Sea Kings may have been defeated somewhere else, but they don't talk too much about it. So what they're doing is they're preparing some client states to operate as military proxies. And we'll go back to the map. Okay. What they started to do was they started to put in military colonies here. They'd conquer people from over in this area. They'd kill the ones they didn't like. They'd convert the ones that were okay, and then they'd move them over here. And that was designed to put a wedge between these two cities and cause consternation to the Marby Valley. And those were the client states that ended up involved in a conflict with the Earthers.
So from your description of the seas and stuff, they move along the coastlines because that's the easiest way to do it. And for instance, those other islands, areas that are out there, no one's attempted or bothered much to go there because it's just too difficult
Right.
to do so.
Yep. There's a lot of big sea critters on Venus. Plus the other thing is you can't navigate effectively because you can't get any star sightings and you can't really get a sun sighting. Plus, if you don't know how to do those things, it's really hard to learn how to do those things on Venus. So that's another technology where the Venusians are really, really far behind. They don't have chronometers, they don't have anything like that, so they can't do, getting a longitude is impossible for them. Even getting a latitude is pretty hard. So they're preparing these client states to operate as military proxies, and they give them, just like the Russians did, the Soviets, they give them the hand-me-downs. The Sea Kings are armed with grenade launchers and a heavy chopping blade. Basically, it's pretty similar to a M79, so it fires a high explosive round. High explosives and propellant are both bioproduced on this planet. There's plants that are known to the Earthers as rocket trees. And it's like sugar cane, only when you squeeze it, you get rocket fuel out instead of sugar. There's also one that's an explosive like that. So,
Do they have a internal, psychology is not quite the right word, but the way they prefer fighting? Would they prefer fighting with the sword, but sometimes they have to go to grenades, or is the sword only a last resort weapon, or how do they like to fight?
we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm glad you asked me that. So let's talk about their strategic outlook. Their strategic outlook is they want to get as many of the other cultures of Venus under their control, so when the final war with the demons breaks out, they have as many resources as possible to fight and win that war. Okay.
So there have been some cases where they absorb the other population.
They absorb the other populations. If nothing else, they'll absorb the children. In terms of operational art, if they're attacking a culture that's in a river valley, what they'll do is they'll try and take the head of the river valley and cut off the water supply to downstream. Since it doesn't rain here, if the water supply is cut off by a dam, then you're going to die of thirst at the bottom of the valley.
But the only way they can get there is to go up the river.
Or go just under.
I thought you couldn't get overland.
You can, but it's tough. Okay? And what they'll do is they'll either do that or they'll go up the edge of the valley because, again, can the people they're fighting defend their whole valley? Or so they'll try and skirt around any of those forces and get to the top of the valley, cut it off. And again, this is where their civil engineering skills come in. And the hope is that as soon as they get there, they'll force a pitched battle with whoever's there, win the battle, it'll be over, and they'll take the valley. If not, they can wait for the culture to surrender because it lacks fresh water. And if that all fails, as soon as they get a big enough lake, they break the dam and flood everybody downstream. So they can go any way there. Or they, in the best of their worlds, they send their ambassadors, show up and say, hey, we've got a great way to live, and if you don't like it, we'll kill you, like we did the other three valleys next to you. Why don't you join up?
But they would use negotiations.
Right.
Do they prefer it to warfare, or just another tool they
It's
use?
just another tool.
Because they could, the way it seems to what you're saying is, they could, notice we're building this dam, and there's any of a couple ways we can get rid of you unless you'd rather fight.
Right. Or you can just surrender. And they may do that even before they begin to implement any of the dam strategies. If they're attacking an island-based culture, first thing they do is destroy any ships and boats. Then they try and destroy any fresh water sources and it goes from there. Siegecraft, they have gas propellant, low velocity howitzers and mortars. So basically think of them as giant pumpkin chuckers or spud guns. So they have large capacity, high explosive shells, and they have incendiaries. When we're talking tactics, Sea Kings depend on their heavy infantry. They'll use their grenade launchers to lay down a smoke screen. Then they'll saturate the enemy line with high explosive shells, and then they'll go in with the sword. So that's their preferred method. So they like a little bit of both. Sea King naval forces. Again, as mentioned before, the Sea Kings do not like the ocean. It is unclean to them. It is full of things that will eat them. They have a bunch of religious practices around it. But they have considerable naval forces because it was really the only way to get around. Most of their vessels are large catamarans or trimarans because if you have a single hull ship, it is easier for the critters to eat it. So they tend to be 200-300 feet long, 2 to 3 hulls. And these vessels are armed with their low velocity howitzers. And a lot of times they'll use those to drop depth charges into the water around them to scare off the sea critters. Sea King cities are built underground to protect them from the sky demons. It's an aesthetic and religious choice more than a military one. It does have some military functions, but for the most part, the Sea Kings are on the offensive, so you don't see their cities as being really fortified. They're surrounded by totems and holy objects to keep the demons away from them, but there has not been an attack on a Sea King city in living memory or even in writing. So you don't see them as being fortified in a traditional sense. Sea King clients, they're armed with cast-off Sea King weapons. They have an older grenade launcher which looks kind of like a blunderbuss. There were grenade throwers from the 18th and 19th century that were basically kind of just small shoulder-mounted mortars. In our timeline and our cultures, it's very similar to that. The largest colony of Sea King clients that was known attacked the international settlement, which was the Earthers' settlement, without permission from the Sea Kings. They got handed their ass. When that happened, the Sea Kings wiped out that failed colony. In retribution, they killed almost all the adult males who had survived the conflict, and they forced the women and children into the desert. One of the ways that the international city, which grew up out of the international settlement, gained a large share of population was religious leaders from Earth decided that they would offer sanctuary to these refugees, women and children, who quickly converted to various Earth-based faiths, Christianity, probably some Islam, maybe some Hinduism, and became very robust members of the international city community because now they weren't being killed. So there's no one who believes as much as a convert, right? So that's what went on there. And this really added maybe 100,000 people to the international city's workforce and community very, very quickly. The Marbi, again, are the hereditary enemies of the Sea Kings. Cannot stand them. They forced us out of what was our promised land, what was our land where we were, where our culture developed. They forced us into the desert. Most of us died. It was terrible. It went on for years. We had an exodus or a long march or whatever you want to call it. We ended up in a different place, which is a good place now, but we still don't like you very much. So the Marbi are very much, if the Marbi could get at the Sea Kings effectively, they sure as hell would.
Are these people as individuals distinguishable from one another?
So there's some interesting things going on in terms of basically phenotypes or racial types on Venus. The people that were first harvested by the aliens were given this whole suite of genetic engineering abilities that allowed them to function in areas where there is very low light. So in terms of vitamin D, all these people could produce vitamin D on their own. They had relatively dark skin tones. They had a bunch of other stuff like that going on. Now, when they took a second harvest and moved it to Venus, the aliens knew that these people were going to be abandoned at some point, so they didn't do all that. What they did was they gave them food sources that were high in vitamin D. There's a frog on Venus that's very high, that's called a cod frog by the Earthers, because it's high in vitamin D. So you can eat it like you eat cod liver oil, you get your vitamin D. So when everything went to hell on Venus and it was abandoned, you had two distinct populations that could survive. One was the ones who had the full suite, and ones were these very pale-skinned people who had access to vitamin D-rich food. So you see some intermixing of them, but there really is, there are some groups that are fairly pure in their
They're not
racial.
distinguishable, the Marbi are not distinguishable from sea kings by physical bodies. They could spy from one of them. I mean, individuals can cross the small, as long
Right.
as can they?
There's probably enough variation in both populations that you could do that.
And then also between social customs, language, something like that.
They
Could somebody spy and try to gather information? And
They could.
And,
They could. Now, languages evolve really, really rapidly, especially in isolation. So, because if you look at even what English was 1,000 years ago, Chaucer's English, even at that, which was only 600, 700 years ago, and English today, there's a huge difference. And in fact, if somebody was speaking Elizabethan English in this room, we would have a very difficult time understanding them. But think about it, if it was in isolation, yes, all the root languages come from a single language, but it's been 3,000 years. So, Latin, then you get.
I mean, it's an interesting concept, but that was all more primitive cultures continually growing up and getting more civilized, and some of them changed.
Right.
Here you have the potential that the aliens gave all these people one language.
They did. They gave them one language.
Would they have been? You're saying they would vary over time?
Oh, absolutely.
As the island.
Right. Absolutely.
Mentality. Okay.
Right. Absolutely. Because even if you look at, until television came out, if you looked at Australian English, American English, English, Canadian English, until television became a universal cultural tool where everybody got the same language spoken at them from American sitcoms and stuff like that, you saw these languages becoming very different very quickly. And you'd see the same thing on Venus, where there are different languages. Okay? Now, the root is this language called Lojban, which is what the aliens taught all the humans who worked for them. And Lojban is actually a real language. It's the logical language. It's an artificial language that's designed so a human being could talk to a computer. And you can look it up. There's a huge Lojban community on the internet and in the world who really honestly believe that Lojban will someday be the language you'll talk. They're completely delusional, but interesting people. Okay? I mean, it's far more complicated than even Esperanto was. So, again, light forces may occasionally cross this environmental buffer zone between the Marbi and the Sea Kings, but that's just nothing bigger than a patrol. Small patrols meet, and it's definitely no quarter asked, no quarter given. The Marbi are heavy infantry. They use a long-range spring-powered weapon, which is designed to outrange the grenade launchers of the Sea Kings. The light infantry also uses this spring-powered weapon. They have two types of cavalry. One is heavy cavalry mounted on giant ground sloths, and the other is a more medium cavalry lancers that are mounted on terror birds. So, and both of those were transplanted from Earth.
There are no horses, or
There are no horses on Venus. And horses don't, in my universe, horses do not do well in acceleration or gravity, so trying to get a horse from Earth to Venus is or any other planet is very difficult. And most of them don't survive. They have psychological problems in zero G. I just didn't want, again, I wanted something different. So there were times we made story decisions that then we had to go back and figure out the science or the math or the psychology behind it. So I went and looked for some figures because I'm a miniature gamer. These are from Eureka. They're Chinese crossbowmen, but they would make pretty good Marby light infantry. So the Marby also have a bunch of religious holidays, and those religious holidays included giant floats, kind of like the dragons in a Chinese New Year parade, things like that. And over time, those evolved from being relatively simple, lightweight, to being more mechanical. And then they developed into being sort of machines and sort of vehicles. And then they developed into, well, we have these religious mock battles that we have used these huge costumes in, and now we'll just use the machines in them. And now, with the coming of the Earthers, they've started to look at those as, hey, the Earthers have these steam tank gizmos, maybe we could do something with our gizmos. So that started to become kind of a thing for them. They're powered by springs. The springs on Venus are really powerful. They're pretty much carbon nanotube springs. They're biologically produced by animals, and then they're harvested. So they have an energy density that's pretty much about half of gasoline, which makes it better than a battery. So it gives them a pretty good ability to store energy in a movable manner. Marby cities are no longer fortified. The Marby used to be that whole river, which is about 1,600 miles long, was a series of independent city-states. In the last 300 years, it has been completely consolidated under one imperial rule. Part of the imperial conquest was, we've taken your city, or you've decided to join the empire. Well, we're going to build you a new city on the holy plans that we have, which is this kind of urbanized religious setting that uses water as energy and a lot of different things. But your old city that had its walls, we're going to tear it down and use its building materials to build the new city. And we're going to do that for two reasons. One is to show that you're now part of this larger collective political entity. And second, to ensure that you don't have a fort you can hide in anymore. So the new cities are they're not fortified in any way. And again, they don't anticipate any type of military action from anywhere else because you can't really get to them across the deserts.
And these average cities have what kind of population?
We figured out that the valley has about 30 million people in it, give or take. I can't remember. I'd have to go back and look because we did some demographic stuff. So most of them are smaller than Rome. They're smaller than 1 million people, significantly smaller than that. And there's a lot. It's 1,600 miles, so you have a lot of farmers, you have a lot of small towns, and then you have these big cities.
Is there a sort of a variation that's fairly common, that you could have any city, or do you have big cities and just little ones, or do you have all?
You have all between. Yeah, they're not highly regimented. A lot depends on what kind of resources are needed in that area, what the transport is needed in that area, and things like that. But those resources are fairly uniform, but again, the way they're being harvested may not be. So. The Marby Empire was consolidated on a combination of military prowess. They also found out how to control the ancient irrigation system in that whole artificial valley they live in, which if you control the water, you control the life. And they made a deal with the Naxley. And we'll talk about the Naxley a little bit more coming up. Marby troops are often part of the Naxley city garrison. Remember, the Marby hate the Sea Kings, and the best place to go fight the Sea Kings is when they when they besieged the Naxley, so the Marby always have a contingent of a few thousand troops right there as part of the city garrison. They also have their own forces ready to move down there quickly if something happens. Marby's standing army is about 120,000, and at any given time, about 10,000 of those troops are in the Naxley city getting rotated in and out. Okay. Cloud kingdoms. The cloud kingdoms actually live in the clouds. They live above 5,000 feet. They're in the cloud forest. They've evolved technologies and cultures that allow them to live where it rains 3 inches every day. One thing they don't do is they don't wear a lot of clothes when they're not in their cities. And their cities are tents. And the way they're designed is that the cities have 2 layers of material above them. One is impermeable on both sides, and that's the top. The inside layer is impermeable so that when wet air rises, it goes through, and then the water gets trapped between these 2 layers and comes out, and that's where their drinking water comes from.
And there is vegetation that lives up in
Oh, there's tons of it. Some of it is plants, but a lot of it is fungus and mushrooms and stuff like that there. So, but it's a cloud forest like any cloud forest on Earth. So the plants are adapted to it. There's a lot of different plants that live up there, a lot of different animals that live up there. It's an exotic environment that's not easy for especially earth plants to take on to, but the Venusian plants that have been here for 1 billion years really do, they're completely adapted to it. Cloud Kingdom forces primarily fight the local tribes. There's a lot of tribes that live up in the cloud forest. The other thing that Cloud Kingdom does is it guards that flank so the Sea Kings can't come up through the cloud forest and then down the valley.
What's the light levels within the cloud?
It's still 80% because whatever comes through to hit the surface has to come through these clouds. So, but it's very wet. It's fairly dark. There's a lot of rain. I mean, think of it as being a typical rainy day.
But what would you estimate a standard visibility of how far you could see somebody
In
coming
the Cloud Kingdom?
that close?
Oh yeah, because you're in the cloud and it's raining on you.
That's why I would think.
So it's not quite that it's dark, it's that you're in fog. So they're almost all melee troops, and we've really tried to come up with weapons for them, and I cannot come up with, I mean, blowguns, yeah, but those are stupid, because I don't think you can, unless you've got a poison blow dart, you're never going to kill anybody with a blow dart.
Fog is a really good way of thinking about it. I hadn't thought about that
Yeah,
myself.
you're in a cloud.
Although it's even within fog, I don't know if I've ever anything that's quite that close. And it is difficult to figure out how one even has interpersonal relationships. I mean, bumping into buildings, I mean, it seems it might be a little more than that. But
Well, but remember that they live in these huge tents, and there's no fog in the tent.
okay.
So,
But they have to be out getting veg, unless are they able to bring some of the vegetation in so they can harvest it and live within there for long periods of time? How often do they have to go outside? I mean, all this sort of feeds into what has.
yeah, well, you might have a point there. We may have to think about that. It may not be this much. It may be to the end of the wall
Yeah.
there, but it's not very far.
I mean, even like 10 yards affects tactics. And
Well, yeah, I mean, the tactics of these guys are, we hide and wait for you to sneak by and we hear you and kill you. It's not so much that we see you and kill you. It's that they're highly adapted to, especially at night, when it's completely pitch black. Because consider a rainy night, you're in the woods, there's no street lights, there's no city lights, there's no car lights. How dark is that? There's no moon, because there is no moon. You can't see the stars.
Habitat is not necessarily poor visibility because of they're in the cloud, but there's also all the vegetation. It's like fighting
Right.
in a jungle.
Yep.
And these people are adapted to the jungle. They know how to do that. Where anybody coming up is much more difficult for them.
Right. So, and a lot of it has more to do with they use their other senses. So they're adapted to that. And they're adapted to, because if you were coming through, it would be more we're going to wait for you. We know where you have to go. You're going to make a ton of noise because you're going to be sloshing through this water. And, you know, sooner or later you're going to walk by us and we're going to kill you. The Naxley, again, basically a city-state, a very large, prosperous city-state with some area around it. They're definitely a slave-using culture. They're a slave-dealing culture. They're not particularly nice people. They will sell anything to anybody. They're a lot like the Ferengi from Star Trek. Again, they're only kind of nice because in comparison to the Sea Kings, they're not quite so horrible. Their primary troops are heavy infantry. Basically, they're city garrison troops. Now, they're not bad city garrison troops. They're very serious about it. They're very good at protecting what they own. But they're not the kind of troops that you could send out to a pitched battle in a field. If they're in their fortifications, they're good to go. If they had to do a stand-up fight against the Sea Kings on an open field, they probably wouldn't stand much of a chance.
Is there a lot of iron for them to work with?
So, interesting thing, there is not a lot of iron on Venus. There's a lot of other metals. And the other thing about it is the Venusians don't mine anything. They have plants that bioaccumulate everything. And if you look at iron, iron is very hard for a plant to bioaccumulate because it's really toxic to most plant species. So they actually bioaccumulate tungsten, they bioaccumulate aluminum, and they bioaccumulate titanium.
That's
And copper and brass and some other
I
stuff.
was just wondering at the evolution of warfare as to whether they would have advantages or perhaps just some work of developing armor, individual armor.
So
become like knights walking around with armor.
they
rather than
actually
when you say
do.
heavy infantry, that can mean a lot of different
Right.
things.
They actually do, but their armor is based on silk. It's not based on metal. It's based on fiber, more like Kevlar, only even stronger. It does have some ceramic plates in it and things like that, but for the most part, it's much more flexible. And I may have a picture. I know I have one in the Venus
Where
book.
in the never-ending cycle is the advantage of projectile versus armor in this situation?
So right now, it's starting to sway back to projectile because the Sea Kings are deploying those newer grenade launchers with better high explosives warheads. Now, the other thing is that very few people, and very few of the cultures here, have any type of field artillery. The Sea Kings are about it. And their field artillery is nowhere near as effective as Earther field artillery. It's got a shorter range, it's lower velocity. Yeah, it has a really good high explosive warhead, but it also doesn't have the rate of fire. So those weapon systems tend to be less effective than Earther ones. And that's one of the technologies that the Venusians are really looking forward to getting their hands on, is things like French 75s and quick firing guns, those kind of things. They also haven't developed anything like gunpowder. They use a bunch of different types of propellants. They have centrifugal guns, they have these gas-powered propellants, they use springs, they use steam. But the funny thing was, I looked all through history, gunpowder is developed one time in all of human history, in China. It's never developed again. It's never developed anywhere else. It's developed one time. It's not like movable press, it gets developed a bunch of places. It's not like all these other technologies that you see in a bunch of different places being developed independently. Gunpowder gets developed once and spread. Okay, but it only gets developed once, and under a fairly obscure set of circumstances, both culturally in terms of the Chinese culture that seek to develop the pure essence of every material they came across, and a culture that had a lot of saltpeter in its soil. So if you don't have saltpeter and you don't have a culture that seeks to purify it, you'll never get gunpowder. And that never happens on Venus. So you end up with a lot of other workarounds. Okay. So, and these are Naxley spring gunners, and you can tell that they're heavily armored. They do have metal helmets, it'd probably be titanium. a lot of times you see tungsten being used as the projectile head because it's high density, it's very heavy, and it keeps its velocity and it can be sharpened, and it's very hard.
Depending on the metallurgy, some aluminum alloys can be extremely hard and
Yep.
very light also, so you
Right.
have potential advantages of that.
Yep. The Naxley Garrison artillery, their medium artillery, is centrifugal guns. They have never worked in Earth technology. People keep trying them. They never, ever really work, but I like them a lot. So these are spun by water. Again, the Naxley city is on this huge waterfall, so it has basically unlimited hydropower. So they can spin these up to the edges is basically just shy of the speed of sound. So that's what their projectiles are coming out at, which is fairly low for a cannon. But if you're shooting 400 or 500 rounds a minute out of it, and those rounds are all round high explosive bombs, or one thing that is super common on all the worlds in the solar system except Earth are these tungsten carbide nodules. No one really knows where they came from, but they're all over the place. And they are from that big around to this big around. And they're almost perfectly spherical. And they're everywhere. There's millions of them. Nobody knows why. I could tell you, but I'd be cheating. Because I know why. But they make great projectiles.
And they're non-destructible, so they're reusable.
Yeah. I mean, those things are pretty much, tungsten carbide is about as hard as you're going to get. They have very rapid fire, and the guns are powered by hydraulic forces from the hydropower they have.
With that kind of shell, well, maybe you would never get high enough it could do, you never get it to a real high velocity.
Right.
So its penetration is almost none, but you get long range because you can hurl it a long way, so if it hits something, it still can do a fair amount of.
Well, the other thing
damage.
is, what are they? They don't need to penetrate armor because there's no tanks, there's no armored vessels. They're fighting field armies.
But I was thinking along the lines of also that if they got the secret of gunpowder or some other explosive material similar to it, a nodule can't be really entirely spherical. It's not going to work as well in a gun barrel as a machined round, and they can't machine these things because they're too hard to be machined, so they're never going to have really super accuracy or super penetration. But still, you can get long range, you can get a certain amount of damage. There are various ways you can handle that to do things.
Right. Now, one way that they do get long range is they have hydraulically pumped ordnance. Again, if you've got a 1,000-foot head of pressure, you can do a lot of things with it to make that ball go pretty darn far and to give it really good velocity. So again, now they do generally trade accuracy for weight of fire, especially with the centrifugal guns. But the other thing is, if you're firing a 1-pound packet of high explosive with a relative effectiveness of 2 compared to TNT, even if you don't penetrate directly, most armor plate is going to fail under a rain of those. Okay, you're not talking World War II tanks. Even if Sherman would, have a problem with that, it would shrug off most of them, but you're going to strip off everything that's not under armor. You're going to strip off all the sights, you're going to strip off the tracks, you're going to strip all that stuff off.
But the silk armor you were talking about with potentially with either aluminum plate or something could potentially be a fairly effective armor against a lot of things.
Well, it could be, but if you get hit with one of those, you're still done.
Okay.
I mean, if you take a direct hit from something moving at 80% the speed of sound that weighs 5 pounds, it doesn't matter what you're wearing, because there's no way that energy is going to get transferred away. Enough of that energy is going to get spread out over enough area so that, at least you're going to get knocked over. That's the very least that's going to happen to you, and you're going to get knocked over really hard. So, because that's a lot of energy that's going to get impacted into you.
Is that thick wall or thin wall of explosive shells?
Thin.
Because
It says think.
It says it's thick wall, which could be either.
Thin. It's a smart round.
It's okay, good.
Okay. So the Naxley also have planned inundation zones in the lower city. So if they're being besieged, first they'll flood large areas so that the enemy troops can't use them. And that'll channel them into areas that they can flood very, very quickly, say a flash flood, where they can put 5 or 6 or 10 feet of water in there in 2 or 3 minutes, if you've ever seen what a flash flood can do, by opening and closing sluice gates. And so they'll channel enemy troops into these areas, and then they'll flood them and kill them. So routes from the lower city to the upper city are heavily fortified, and they're demolished to be designed to be demolished as needed. So the other city on the coast is the monks. The monks really try and stay out of things. They're much more, they do a lot of trading.